A Chinese naval flotilla is pushing into Venezuelan waters. The flag on the mast says defensive exercises, maritime security, joint drills, routine cooperation. But the real message is simple. Don't touch Beijing's assets. Because Venezuela isn't just a fragile country with bad headlines. Venezuela is an oil valve, a geopolitical pressure point, and a living ledger of Chinese money. And if Washington squeezes hard enough to crack the regime, Beijing doesn't just lose a partner. It loses billions, leverage, and the credibility of its protection. That's why the ships arrive, not to fire first, but to turn every move, inspect, seize, block, restrict, into escalation risk. To understand why this matters, you have to stop thinking about Venezuela as a country and start thinking about it as a mechanism that moves barrels, settles debts, anchors contracts, and keeps long-term investments from turning into ash. For years, China built its position in Venezuela around one goal: continuity. Not ideology, not friendship. Continuity. Continuity keeps repayment schedules alive. Continuity keeps oil for loan structures from collapsing. Continuity keeps ports, pipelines, refineries, and infrastructure projects from becoming stranded assets. Continuity keeps Beijing's broader message intact. If you align with China, you won't be left alone when pressure comes. Now Washington is testing that message, not with speeches, but with tools that don't need permission from the United Nations or support from allies. Washington's real weapon isn't a missile, it's fear. Fear inside the private sector, secondary sanctions, insurance exclusions, banking compliance, port restrictions, the ability to make commerce too risky to touch the moment the U.S. signals that anyone, ship owner, insurer, trader, broker, bank, who touches Venezuelan crude could face penalties. The private sector reacts faster than governments. Shipping doesn't wait for enforcement. Insurers don't wait for the first fine. Banks don't wait for the first headline. They price the risk immediately. And once risk is priced, activity shrinks. This is how flows slow without a blockade. The oil doesn't vanish. But the system that moves oil becomes afraid to touch it. That fear alone can tighten markets because energy is traded on confidence as much as supply. Traders hedge. Logistics firms raise rates. Refiners look for substitutes. Governments build buffers. And in a tight market, even a small disruption becomes a large spike. That spike bleeds into inflation expectations, currency pressure, and political stress, especially in countries that import energy and already live close to the edge. Beijing knows this playbook. It has watched it used in other theaters, and it understands what it implies. If the U.S. can choke the financial and insurance plumbing around Venezuelan oil, it can threaten continuity without firing a shot. Which means the question for China becomes brutally practical. How do you protect an asset when the attacker's strongest tool is making everyone else too scared to do business? You can't solve that with a press release. You can't solve it with a loan. You solve it by raising the cost of interference, physically, visibly, immediately. That's what an escort does. A tanker alone is commerce. A tanker, under the shadow of warships, becomes geopolitics. And geopolitics is deterrence by design. You don't have to fire first. You just need the other side to calculate the possibility that firing could happen. But the fleet is only half the counterpunch. The other half is more dangerous because it doesn't happen in the Caribbean. It happens inside the U.S. economy. Strategic inputs, rare earths, processed components, precision materials, the hidden skeleton of modern manufacturing, magnets, motors, sensors, high-performance alloys, specialized chemicals, and the downstream parts that make advanced factories run. These are not headline commodities like oil. They don't make people panic in real time. That's why they're powerful. Because Beijing doesn't need a dramatic embargo. It can use friction, licensing delays, approval slowdowns, broader dual-use definitions, new documentation demands, selective enforcement. On paper it looks bureaucratic. In reality, it bites like a knife. The damage isn't instant like a missile strike. It's slow, like poison. Production slips, inventories drain, costs rise, margins shrink, delivery schedules break, penalty clauses trigger, earnings miss, layoffs begin. And by the time the public notices, when prices rise and jobs vanish, the chain reaction is already underway. This is leverage versus leverage. Strangulation versus strangulation. The U.S. threatens regime survival through oil revenue and financial access. China threatens industrial rhythm and supply chain stability through strategic inputs. Once both sides start pulling, neither wants to be the first to let go. Because the prize isn't just barrels or contracts, it's credibility. Washington's credibility is the enforcement toolkit itself: sanctions reach, financial access, insurance power, and the message that rules written in Washington still shape global trade. If a rival power can wrap a protective shield around a sanctioned partner, especially in the Western Hemisphere, it sets a precedent the U.S. cannot easily tolerate. It would mean U.S. pressure can be neutralized by a peer. Beijing's credibility is the promise behind its global network. The Chinese financing and partnership aren't a one-way bet that can be erased when the U.S. tightens the screws. If Venezuela collapses under U.S. pressure, every other partner learns the same lesson. Chinese support does not protect you when American leverage turns hard. That lesson is poison for Beijing's long-term strategy. That's why this crisis is so unstable. It isn't driven only by interests. It's driven by reputation. And reputation creates commitment traps. Here's how the escalation ladder forms. First, Washington signals it can raise pressure beyond economics into regime-level consequences, not just less money, but less survival. Second, Beijing raises the physical cost of interference by moving naval assets into the theater under a friendly banner. Third, Beijing signals the economic battlefield is not one way by tightening strategic material flows. Fourth, markets begin to price disruption. Oil volatility, shipping risk premiums, insurance costs, and the sense that trade infrastructure itself is being weaponized. At that point, the global system starts behaving as if it's entering a storm, even without a single missile. Because the two lifelines that break modern economies fast are energy uncertainty and component uncertainty. When energy becomes volatile, everything becomes expensive. When components become scarce, everything becomes late. Combine both, and you get the worst macro mix. Inflation pressure returns while growth weakens. Central banks hesitate. Investors flee risk. Companies freeze hiring. Households feel it last through higher bills and shrinking job security. And the darkest part is that escalation doesn't require evil intent. It requires friction. One boarded vessel, one detained crew, one radar lock, one warning shot, one collision. Maritime confrontations compress decisions into minutes. A diplomat can negotiate for weeks. A captain has seconds. A ship can't wait for a committee while another hull cuts across its bow. The sea punishes hesitation. It forces reaction. And reactions become incidents. Incidents become headlines. Headlines become domestic outrage. Domestic outrage becomes orders. Orders become escalation. This is why the first conflict rarely arrives wearing the word war. It arrives wearing paperwork, sanctions expansions, compliance warfare, quiet licensing rules, insurance exclusions, banking fear. And then, one day, it arrives wearing steel, close enough that everyone can see the gray paint, read the hull numbers, and realize this isn't abstract anymore. Because once escorts are present, enforcement becomes a test. If the U.S. attempts to inspect, seize, or detain a tanker under the shadow of an escort, it isn't just applying law. It's challenging a rival's deterrent posture in a confined space where mistakes are easy and humiliation is contagious. And humiliation is the one variable markets can't price until it's too late. So the real question isn't, will there be a war? The real question is, how many steps can both sides take before they reach a moment neither can politically tolerate? And when that moment comes, not in a speech, but in a split-second decision at sea, what happens next won't be decided by economists or analysts. It will be decided by captains, rules of engagement, and leaders who fear the cost of looking weak. In Part 2, we're going to map the three paths this crisis can take. The light path of paperwork and compliance, the medium path of maritime enforcement, and the worst-case path where one small incident flips the narrative from policy to attack. And once that flip happens, Venezuela stops being the story. It becomes the fuse, where the crisis stops being a headline and becomes a mechanism. 3 pathways, 3 speeds, 1 direction. The first is the light path: paperwork, compliance warfare, and the quiet weaponization of trade infrastructure. This is Washington's preferred battlefield because it scales globally without firing a shot. The U.S. doesn't need to physically blockade Venezuela. It only needs to make Venezuelan commerce radioactive. The moment Washington signals that any ship, insurer, trader, broker, or bank touching Venezuelan crude could be penalized, the private sector reacts faster than any government can argue. Shipping companies don't wait for enforcement. Insurers don't wait for the first fine. Banks don't wait for the second headline. They price risk instantly, and once risk is priced, activity shrinks. Not because the oil disappears, but because the system that moves oil becomes afraid to touch it. That fear alone is enough to tighten markets, because energy trades on confidence as much as supply. Traders hedge, freight rates rise, risk premiums expand, and suddenly a country's barrels can exist on paper while becoming functionally stranded in reality. And that is the genius of compliance warfare. It turns the global economy into Washington's enforcement arm without Washington needing to show up everywhere at once. But the light path has a second edge that people miss. Once you push commerce into a gray zone, you create a shadow market, rerouted cargo, renamed paperwork, ship-to-ship transfers, flag swaps, opaque intermediaries, and a cat-and-mouse game that never ends. Each new restriction spawns a new workaround, and each workaround triggers a harsher response. So even the quiet path generates momentum, and momentum is what creates mistakes. Now overlay Beijing's answer in the light path. China doesn't need a dramatic embargo to hurt the U.S. It can use controlled friction in strategic materials, rare earths, processed inputs, specialized components, the quiet skeleton of high-tech manufacturing, tighten export licensing, stretch approvals, expand dual-use definitions, add documentation demands, apply selective enforcement. On paper, it looks like bureaucracy. In reality, it behaves like a slow poison. The damage arrives in procurement offices first. Just in time becomes not in time. Then it shows up in factory schedules, then in delivery delays, then in margins, then in layoffs. The public only notices at the end of the chain when prices rise and jobs vanish. But by then, the reaction has already rippled across suppliers, inventories, and earnings calls. That's why this path is so dangerous. It doesn't shock you into caution. It bleeds you into anger, and anger narrows choices. Economic pain doesn't calm crises. It pushes leaders to seek more leverage, more punishment, more strength, because backing down starts to look like surrender. That's how the light path turns into the second pathway, the medium path, maritime enforcement. This is where the crisis leaves boardrooms and enters the ocean. It begins with one event: an inspection, a boarding attempt, a detention, a seizure. On paper, it's law. In reality, it's a test. Because once Chinese naval assets are present as escorts, any attempt to stop or seize a tanker becomes a direct challenge. The confrontation doesn't need missiles. It can start with shadowing. A Chinese ship slides into position between an approaching vessel and a tanker. Radio warnings tighten. Maneuvers get sharper. Distances shrink. Everyone stays professional. And that's what makes it dangerous, because professionals follow rules of engagement. And rules of engagement exist for deterrence, not for saving face. The sea compresses time. Diplomats can negotiate for weeks. Ships must decide in minutes. Captains can't wait for committees while another hull cuts across their bow. They turn, accelerate, signal, react, and reactions become incidents. Incidents become headlines. Headlines become domestic outrage. Domestic outrage becomes orders. Orders become escalation. Markets react differently to the medium path than they do to paperwork. The light path creates volatility. The medium path creates fear of physical disruption. If traders believe tankers might be stopped, they don't just hedge, they hoard. They scramble for alternative supply. They build inventories. That behavior tightens the market by itself. And in a tight market, even a small disruption produces a large spike. That spike bleeds into inflation expectations, currency pressure in import-dependent countries, and financial stress in places already living close to the edge. This is how a regional standoff becomes a global energy shock without a declared war. And then there's the third pathway, the worst-case path, where the medium path crosses a political line leaders cannot tolerate. Not a grand battle. Something small but visible and humiliating. A warning shot that hits metal, a drone downed, a radar jam, a ship damaged, a sailor injured, a crew detained. The moment that happens, the narrative flips from enforcement to attack. And once attack enters the narrative, leaders lose room to maneuver. They respond not because they want war, but because they fear the cost of not responding. This is how great powers slide into conflict, not by desire, but by commitment traps. China's fleet becomes a tripwire. If Beijing claims it is protecting shipping, failing to react to a challenge looks like weakness. The U.S. posture becomes a tripwire. If Washington claims its rules must be enforced, allowing escorts to neutralize pressure looks like weakness. Two tripwires, two domestic storms, two incentives to escalate, and escalation rarely stays contained. Once the worst-case path triggers, it doesn't stop at Venezuela. Cyber pressure rises. Financial restrictions widen. Other shipping routes become riskier. Other flashpoints become linked. The world shifts from a crisis to a climate, a new normal of confrontation. And the most unsettling part is that none of this requires anyone to be irrational. It only requires each side to be consistent with its own logic. Washington must defend the credibility of sanctions and enforcement. Beijing must defend the credibility of its global network and the promise that its backing matters. When credibility is the prize, compromise becomes politically toxic, and the only exits that work are face-saving exits, quiet carve-outs, narrow exemptions, third-party buffers, deconfliction protocols at sea, back-channel arrangements that let both sides claim they didn't blink. Because the real danger is not when the crisis is loud. The real danger is when it looks manageable right before the next step makes it unmanageable. In Part 3, we're going to talk about the end game, what each side truly wants, what each side fears most, and what kind of escape hatch could exist before a single maritime mistake turns deterrence into pride, and pride turns a standoff into a storm that markets, governments, and households can't outrun. The end game isn't about Venezuela. It's about credibility. And credibility is the one prize that makes compromise feel like surrender. That's why this crisis is so hard to cool down once it starts moving. Washington's core objective is not simply to punish a sanctioned regime. It's to protect the belief that American enforcement tools still work at scale. Sanctions reach, financial access, insurance pressure, banking compliance, port restrictions, and the quiet ability to make commerce too risky to touch. If a rival power can create a protective umbrella around a sanctioned partner, especially in the Western Hemisphere, it sets a precedent Washington cannot accept. It teaches every future target that U.S. pressure can be neutralized by bringing in a peer. And if that lesson spreads, the U.S. doesn't just lose one confrontation, it loses the deterrent value of its entire toolkit. Beijing's core objective is equally simple and equally unforgiving. It has spent 2 decades building a global network that runs on one assumption: Chinese money creates staying power. Chinese financing, infrastructure, and long-term deals are supposed to be a shield against external pressure, not a liability that gets erased the moment Washington turns the screws. If Venezuela collapses under U.S. pressure, Beijing doesn't just lose sunk capital, it loses the belief that Chinese backing protects anyone when American power decides to squeeze hard. That belief is the currency behind Beijing's wider strategy. Without it, partners hedge away from China, contracts become riskier, and the entire network weakens. So both sides fight for the same invisible asset: reputation. And reputation creates commitment traps. Once leaders publicly tie strength to outcomes, walking away becomes politically expensive, even if walking away would be strategically rational. That's how escalation happens without anyone wanting a great power war. You don't need madness. You only need incentives that punish restraint. Now look at the psychological geometry of the trap. Washington can't afford to look like it blinked in its own neighborhood. Beijing can't afford to look like its shield is fake. Each side believes it is defending order. Washington says it is defending rules and enforcement. Beijing says it is defending sovereignty and commercial stability. Both narratives are designed for domestic audiences, and domestic audiences do not reward nuance. They reward dominance. They punish hesitation, which means every small incident becomes amplified into a test of national pride. And pride is the accelerant markets can't price until it burns. This is why the most dangerous phase of the crisis is not the first naval deployment and not the first sanctions announcement. The most dangerous phase is the middle, when both sides have invested enough posture that backing down feels humiliating, but not enough damage has occurred to force a serious negotiation. That's where miscalculation lives. One commander tries to enforce, another tries to deter. Distances shrink. Radio calls harden. Everyone acts professionally. Then something tiny goes wrong. A misread maneuver, a jammed signal, a near collision, a warning shot that was meant to miss but hits, a detained crew that becomes a televised outrage. Once the story flips from enforcement to attack, leaders lose room to maneuver. They respond not because they want war, but because they fear the cost of not responding. The system doesn't need a declared war to behave like one. Persistent disruption is enough. Higher energy prices, tighter components, rising risk premiums, frozen investment, and the slow bleed of household confidence. When households feel squeezed, politics hardens. When politics hardens, compromise becomes harder. The loop feeds itself. And that's the macro danger. Energy uncertainty and component uncertainty are the two lifelines that break modern economies fast. When energy becomes volatile, everything becomes expensive. When components become scarce, everything becomes late. Combine both and you get the worst mix: inflation pressure with weakening growth. Central banks hesitate. Investors flee risk. Companies freeze hiring. Layoffs begin. Then leaders face pressure to do something, and doing something usually means escalating leverage, not releasing it. So what could actually stop this from spiraling? Not friendship, not trust. The only real exits are face-saving exits, arrangements that let both sides claim they achieved something while quietly stepping back from direct contact. One exit is compliance theater. Washington claims tighter monitoring and symbolic enforcement, while quietly allowing certain flows under narrow carve-outs so the market doesn't break. Beijing claims it stabilized shipping and protected its interests while lowering the visibility of its naval posture. Another exit is a buffer mechanism at sea. Deconfliction protocols, corridor rules, hotline procedures, third-party monitoring. Anything that reduces the chance two armed ships are forced into split-second decisions inside a confined theater. Another exit is linkage, easing one pressure point in exchange for easing another so both sides can sell reciprocity rather than retreat. For example, narrow exceptions for energy flows paired with quieter material export approvals, calibrated in a way that neither side has to publicly admit it traded concessions. The key isn't the paperwork. The key is giving both capitals a story they can sell at home, because the real danger is not when the crisis is loud. The real danger is when it looks manageable right before the next step makes it unmanageable. If there's a lesson here, it's that escalation rarely arrives wearing the word war. It arrives wearing routine, a defensive exercise, a compliance update, an insurance review, a licensing revision, a lawful inspection. And then one day it arrives wearing steel close enough that everyone can see it. And by then the system is already behaving as if conflict is the new normal. Venezuela is where two lifelines intersect: oil and strategic inputs, and where two great powers are testing credibility in a confined space. If both sides keep tightening, instability becomes the default, even if no one intends catastrophe. But if a single maritime mistake turns deterrence into humiliation, then the crisis stops being about policy and starts being about pride. And pride is the one variable that turns a standoff into a storm.